Welcome to the course Qualitative Methods for Business and Management. This brief video lecture is about quality assurance in case study research. Before we begin, we must remember that the case study methods per se is philosophically neutral, meaning it can be used within different philosophical traditions. This matters because these different traditions employ different criteria for evaluating the quality of case study research. A classical way of using case studies is in the positivist tradition, meaning that we have a realist ontology of the world combined typically with an empiricist epistemology, meaning that if we measure things or properties well about things in the real world, we can trust this data and allows us to evaluate theoretical predictions. This tradition emphasizes theory testing, and we can use case studies to evaluate, compare, and test certain theoretical predictions. In this tradition, and some of the main proponents you might come across are case study authors such as Yin or Bempasad. They have written guidelines and books on this topic. And in their viewpoint, we have quality criteria such as construct validity. How valid are the constructs that are developed for my explanations? Internal validity. How true is my explanation? External validity, meaning how generalizable is my explanation, and reliability, how replicable and consistent are my procedures. In this tradition, we favor multiple case designs over single case designs because this way we can strengthen external validity and we can strengthen reliability and increase robustness in our testing of theoretical predictions. This contrasts with case study usage in the interpretive tradition, so meaning where we are concerned with double hermeneutic procedures, where we are interpreting the interpretation of others as they socially construct their reality. So here, instead of using a case study as a reality check, so to speak, of theory versus data, here we emphasizing emerging of meaning and insight from the data. And the quality criteria are very different. Here, quality criteria include notions of dependability. Would others reach similar interpretations to the one that I'm offering? How plausible is my interpretation? So how credible is it? Can I confirm my interpretation? Do I have a chain of evidence to support my interpretation? And how transferable? So that means, can I use the concepts that I'm using to describe my interpretation? Can I apply them somewhere else? Can I transfer them to other contexts? In this tradition, both single and multiple case designs are fine because in both of them I can emphasize the emergence of meaning from data. In the positivist tradition, one helpful metaphor to think about these concepts of validity, construct, internal, external, and reliability is that of you shooting with an arrow to hit a target. What we are trying is to shoot multiple arrows and always hit bullseye. So to get as close as possible and as consistent as possible to the truth that we have in reality, because these facts about the real world, if they are reliable and valid, we can trust. And in this sense, validity means whether the data and concepts that we develop approximate this truth that is out there about whatever it is that we set out to study. Yeah, so this would be the image on the far right, where you can see that we've measured something multiple times and we get a consistent answer that is close to whatever the truth score really is. Reliability means that procedures, measurements, and results are consistent. They don't vary, as in the second to the right picture, where we do approximate the true score, bullseye, once, but with multiple measures, we're literally all over the place. The second image from the left is the opposite example. We actually have reliable procedures, measurements, and results, but they're actually off. Yeah, so they are really not getting to the true score of what it is. And of course, the worst situation is that we have neither reliability nor validity. Then really we can't make anything of our results. And in case study research, we have different tests or different tactics, you could say, to demonstrate that we are meeting expectations for construct, internal, external validity, and reliability. So, for example, for reliability, so the question whether the study can be repeated by others with consistent results, we have tactics that we use, such as the development, use, and sharing of a case study protocol, and the development of a case study database that we can um, share with others. Both of these are in the collecting stage, and both of these would help others to replicate, to repeat our procedures. For external validity, so the question how well our data and findings can be applied beyond the circumstances of the case, is very simple, that we have this tactic of replication logic, theoretical, literal, and snowball sampling logic in multiple case study design. So during the research design phase, we typically make choices to increase the robustness and validity by selecting and sampling multiple cases. Similar in internal validity, so the question of whether the explanation is really the true explanation of what is going on. We have tactics such as pattern matching, logic models, explanation buildings. All of these are tactics or techniques we use during data analysis. And construct validity to see whether we found the most appropriate way to measure what is really going on, what we want to assess. We have tactics such as relying on multiple sources of evidence, triangulations, and key informant reviews that we can use to establish these quality requirements. So one of these is, for example, this notion of multiple sources of evidence. The idea here is that you build construct validity. So, for example, you could ask employees in an organization about organizational performance, and they would give you their feedback in terms of, I think we're doing well, I think we're doing okay, we just had a really good year. So that would be one source of evidence that this organization is performing well. But of course, there would be other sources of evidence that you could use. For example, an annual report, a balance sheet, a profit statement, stuff like that. And ideally, if your measurement of performance approaches the true score, the actual performance, then you should have consistent results across multiple sources of evidence. And here, this is a very useful slide. You see that when we talk about multiple sources of evidence, these different sources that we're talking about, interviews, observation, archival records, and so forth, they have different strengths or weaknesses. Yeah, so interviews can be very flexible, very insightful, but of course, there can be all sorts of biases. We can be biased, the response could be biased, people can lie to us, they may not remember, they may recall incorrectly, and so forth. Yeah, documentation has strength in the sense that they're stable, persistent, typically exact, not necessarily, but maybe we have problem in accessing them. Maybe we can't retrieve them. Maybe they're biased themselves, and so forth. So the idea here is, of course, to combine sources of evidence that have multiple different strengths and offset each other's weaknesses. Another tactic that we had here in this tradition is this notion of maintaining a chain of evidence. What does it mean? It means that you try to describe to an outsider how you arrive from the data that you collected to the interpretation and conclusions that you're drawing. So this is typically by maintaining a chain of evidence from the questions to the protocol. How did you arrive at the protocol that you used for interviewing, say, from the research question that you asked? How do you have, which data is in your database? What are the sources? How do you link to these sources? And of course, how do you put whatever is in the database later into your report where you show the conclusions? So the idea would be that an observer or reader should always be able to trace in any direction to and from the report with the conclusions all the way back to the data, database, protocol, and the questions if need be. How do we do this? This would be an example of something that you could see in a paper. This is a so-called data structure. And this data structure shows from left to right, shows raw data, in this particular case, statements that certain people said that were interviewed, to ways in which we analyze this data through a multiple rounds of coding process. Yeah. So in this case, from open codes to categories to constructs. And you see the linkages visualized through arrows and lines with steps described and so forth. So the idea is here that you can always trace back from the right-hand side where we have a conclusion such as that organizations probe the solution space, that we can link that back through different steps of analysis all the way to something someone really said. This would be an example of how people try to construct a chain of evidence. So these are some of the tactics that we use in positivist case studies where we look for notions of validity and reliability. But these two notions don't make sense in the interpretive worldview because we don't have an objectively existing reality that we can use as a baseline to um, to regard as truth that we can measure ourselves against. So here in the interpretive worldview, we don't have an objective reality that exists independent of the observer. Rather, we have a social construction of reality where we use terms and concepts as signifiers to signal a meaning that is meaningful to us. For example, our particular interpretation of the word organization to describe the place where we work. Here we study not subject to object relationships with objective and measurable properties, but rather subject to subject relationships. So we are interpreting the interpretations of others. So in this worldview, we don't have validity because we don't know, or there is no absolute truth score that we can measure how close we get to those close scores. Instead, we have alternative criteria, tests, and then tactics that we can use to also be able to evaluate the quality of case study research. And these tests are called dependability, credibility, confirmability, and transferability, as I've just explained them to you. So here's an example. In a positivist tradition, we typically talk about the reliability of case study research procedures. To what extent can we repeat the procedures and get to the same results? In an interpretive perspective, dependability is not based on outsiders getting the same results, but rather that outsiders can concur that given the data collected, your interpretation, your results make sense. So your interpretations are dependable and consistent, even though people may not agree with them. But they concur that there is a sense making, a logical dependability in your interpretation, how you arrived at them. And again, importantly, they may not have to agree with you. They just need to understand how dependable, how you reached your conclusion. One of the very important notions to realize is that independent of the worldview, the tactics that we have and the tests that we employ, they're basically equivalent. So credibility in interpretive research is really the equivalent of internal validity in the positivist world. Yeah, so the validity or credibility of findings means whether we have evidence for the interpretation or explanation that we're offering here. How do we know that this is my explanation is the true explanation? How do we know that my interpretation is a credible explanation? The only difference is that we have used different tactics, procedures, and steps and tests that we can use to demonstrate validity or credibility. Same, I'm jumping to reliability, dependability here. Dependability means that individuals other than the researchers can consider the observations and would reach similar or same conclusions. So it's similar to reliability in that both of them are about the consistency of findings and results. And as you can see on the right-hand side, we just use different tools, not so much protocols and database where we store true evidence, facts, but rather we use tactics such as corroboration and reflexivity and in trying to evaluate and improve whether our results are dependable. Um, One more example in the second row, constructability, confirmability. Confirmability means that our findings can be verified or challenged by others, participants, other researchers, outside experts, and so forth. In that sense, it's similar to construct validity in that we're trying to say that whatever our interpretation is really about what's going on here. What we do here is, in the interpretive world, for example, we employ a principle of suspicion, meaning that even in a research team, or we use someone else from the outside, we get someone into our team that comes in with a mindset of not agreeing to anything we're saying, to be suspicious and critical about any interpretation that we are offering, so that we constantly have to defend our interpretation to the point that the suspicious outsider has no other choice but to confirm that our interpretation is robust. How do we do some of these things? What is very important is transparency and procedural clarity. Case studies independent of the worldview is very important that we're very clear and transparent of where and how we got data. Who are the interviews? What is it about them? What are they doing? What makes them key informants? So how do we know that the people we talk to really have something to say about the case? A second tactic in interpretive tradition that I briefly mentioned is this idea of corroboration and dialogical reasoning, What that means is that you try to corroborate your own interpretation that you're developing by getting feedback from the participants that you asked and or others. Yeah. So in the interview stage, how that plays out in practice would be that when someone makes a statement about how life is for them at this organization and you interpret that as you listen to them, you can basically try to corroborate your interpretation through statements such as, what I hear you say is this and this. Can you confirm that? Like, is this what you mean? Yeah, so these sorts of tactics, they seem very innocuous. We can try to corroborate how what we are interpreting, what other people are telling us. Yeah. And this idea of bringing a critical and suspicious outsider or member of the research team is a form that's called dialogical reasoning, that we offer a reason and we literally try to shoot down our own ideas, our own interpretations. So we're critical, skeptical, suspicious, and we enter this dialogue that we try to defend, or someone tries to defend their interpretation to the point that we have nothing to be suspicious or critical about it anymore. And when we reach that point, we know that we're done. External validity, aka transferability of case studies in the different tradition, is concerned with the extent to which findings can be applied to other situations, right? Quantitatively, we would enhance external validity using a priority conditions. But in case study, we do not have these means, right? So the first notion is that external validity transferability is always going to be problematic in qualitative research. In qualitative research, we're compromising cross-sectional broadness or breadth by focusing on subjective accuracy or depth. We want to focus on a single case or a small non-random sample, and we select that precisely because we want to understand something in depth, not in breadth. Yeah, so we are basically willingly trading off transferability, external validity for ideally heightened internal and construct validity. We find out what's really going on in this one case rather than in general and for all. As a final point, let's look at how do we evaluate case studies? How do we know whether case studies are good? These are 6 heuristics that people can use very, very roughly as a rule of thumb if you want, to evaluate the quality of case studies. First of all, case studies should be interesting. They should be exciting and compelling to read. They should have sufficient evidence and they should be complete. They should tell all the story, not just part of the story. And they should have a lot of data and evidence in there that we know that our report of the case is really what's going on. Ideally, the case study should also consider multiple alternative perspectives, right? So this idea of multiple sources of evidence, looking at a picture in rich, holistic ways should really shine through. So you could think of it is that if you study an organization, you should really talk to the senior bosses, the directors, the managers, the low-level frontline employees, as well as the customers. Multiple alternative perspectives. And case studies that do that really well are better than those that don't. So, which are the components that we look at mostly? Well, we look for transparency and clarity and justification in our methods and procedures. We look at what data is available, how is it being displayed, how strong, robust is this data? Yeah, do we have quotations? Do we have statistics perhaps? Do we have documents? How many archival records? How many interviews were being done? And so forth. We look for evidence of continual verification. So we try to figure out what did the researchers do to triangulate, consider counterexample, contradictions. What did they do to corroborate their findings and so forth? How did they verify their procedures and findings? And of course, we're looking for how close are the researchers to the phenomenon. How often did they go? Did they ever visit the company? Did they just interview a bunch of people via Zoom? How close were the research team really to the phenomenon in the real life setting where it occurs? And this brings us to the end of this part, this lecture on quality assurance in case study methods. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening.